I am in downtown LA, enjoying the weather, as you can see. I'm a little bit late with this live stream. This is usually supposed to be an 8 a.m. live stream lecture, but unfortunately we had some connectivity issues. The apartment I'm staying at is so high up over the ground on floor 29 that we can't get a proper cell phone signal. So I'm now sitting in the hotel lounge. You can see outside the pool area. So this is going to be a very improvised poolside lecture. If you're wondering, I'm also holding up the phones in my palm, so apologies for the poor camera angle. I'm just so glad that this worked out. I'm so glad that we were able to find a signal. I'm so glad that we can start our Monday in philosophical fashion together. That makes me really, really happy. And if you're new to this series and you're wondering what this even is, every Monday for the past 2 years, I've been hosting an Introduction to Philosophy and Theory lecture, a live stream open access lecture, because I believe that education should be free for everybody, no matter where you're joining from. And that's been a passion project that I've done for 2 years now, sharing these lectures with you and sharing this space with you. And that is just a wonderful way for me to start my week, and hopefully also a way to introduce you guys to some philosophical themes in a way that is hopefully entertaining and stimulating without dumbing it down too much. As per usual, I want to say hello to everybody who's joining from around the world. Welcome, welcome. I see some people joining from India and South Africa. I always love hearing where you're joining me from, so please do, if you have a moment, drop a comment letting me know where you are right now. I'm in downtown LA, very much enjoying it. I am in the hotel lobby because my room doesn't have proper internet. I see Stockholm. Says, do you post these lectures as reels? The lectures are about an hour long, so I actually post them as audio files, as a podcast for patrons. Basically, all these live streams are saved for free on YouTube and Instagram, but if you'd like to support this project, and if you'd like to also download them as a podcast, please do consider joining our global community of patrons. That is www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. And that's really how we fund this project. The idea is that these lectures are open access and free, but if you'd like to help me keep them free, I'd highly appreciate your support as a patron. And as a patron, you can get access to lots of bonus features, like audio downloads for every lecture, edited transcripts for every lecture. That's 2 years running now. A Q&A seminar that I host after every lecture on Discord, which I also post for patrons. And of course, my ebook titled Spurious Infinities, The Cultural Logic of Postmodernism. All that and more you can access if you are a patron. I see someone joining from London. Hello, London. That's where I lived for many, many years. I see the south of Brazil. Bom dia, or bom dia, Brazil. So yeah, today we're going to be continuing I see someone from Romania, hello. Today we're going to be continuing the Intro to Hegel lecture series. And once again, apologies for the poor camera angle. I couldn't get a signal this morning, so I'm in the hotel lobby. And outside you can see some palm trees, maybe the pool. We'll see. Okay, so today we're going to be continuing the Introduction to Hegel lecture series. And my personal belief, and I think many philosophers would agree, is that Hegel is perhaps the preeminent figure within certainly continental philosophy, but perhaps even the history of philosophy as such. And that if you want to study philosophy, at some point you have to grapple with Hegel. And if you will, there was a very productive period of thought that took place between Kant's writing of the Critique of Pure Reason and Hegel's death. It was like a 60-year span in which so much happened within philosophy, whether it's Kant, the famous four figures of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, but of course we could also add Schlegel to that, or the poet Hölderlin. There was this explosion of creativity and originality within philosophy that remains unmatched as of today. And so the idea is to, quote unquote, return to Hegel, but not to return to Hegel in a sort of academic sense, but rather to try to see Hegel as a stepping stone towards really understanding and inhabiting contemporary ideas, whether they are ideas that come from critical theory or Marxism or even analytic philosophy, going back to Hegel in order to understand our present moment a little bit better. So what I'm going to try to do in this series, and I've already done it for the past 3 weeks, which you can find saved on YouTube and Instagram, is to really go over some key Hegelian topics, ideas, and concepts in a way that is hopefully accessible and perhaps even a little bit entertaining for you. So today I'm going to sprinkle some Žižek jokes into this class. I'm going to briefly pivot here. I wish that I had like a way to prop up my phones. I'm like double fisting these phones. I'm holding them. You can see, hello Instagram, hello YouTube. Okay, so Slavoj Žižek has a joke that I quite like. That's I think a pretty good place to start. And you know, I am actually going to look to see if I can bunch up these phones and something. Give me one moment. I'm going to try to like do something. All right, that's my sweater. See if I can prop up my phone on the sweater. There you go. That's so much better. Now I've got my hands. Okay, thank you guys so much for bearing with me as I'm traveling and trying to host these lectures on the road. So Žižek has this joke that I really like, where he talks about a man who goes to Siberia, and he agrees that from Siberia, he is going to write letters telling his other friend what the conditions are like in the prison camp. And so he writes these letters, and his friend receives letters from the prison camp in Siberia. And they have one rule, one important detail. The rule is that if he writes things in blue ink, everything that he's writing is true. If he writes it in red ink, then everything he's writing is false. It's like a code that the two friends share. And so a letter arrives from Siberia, and it says, "Oh, my dear friend, everything in Siberia is much better than I thought. They have wonderful amenities. There's good food. The weather is better than I thought. The guards are so friendly to us. Overall, it's really just perfect. The only thing that we don't have access to is red ink." It's a classic Žižek joke, of course. Now, the red ink would imply that it's true. The blue ink would imply that it's untrue. Therefore, everything is untrue, including not having red ink. It's a classic philosophical problem. And Žižek essentially says that this is something that we can interpret today. We don't have red ink. We have the freedom to choose between many amenities and commodities, but fundamentally we don't have the freedom to choose the manner in which that choice is made. This is what is also known within existentialist circles as the illusion of choice, that you are given the parameters in which you can make a choice, and yet fundamentally you lack the power to frame the manner in which the choice is given to you. Think about, for example, an Elon Musk Twitter poll, which is presented to you as direct democracy and the voice of the people and the voice of God. And yet, the one thing you can't choose is what you're choosing between. In other words, your power, therefore, remains restricted. It's the illusion of choice. You thereby have a choice between two options, but you don't have the choice to determine the way in which those options are presented to you. And if you will, we have this illusion of choice magnified within contemporary consumer societies. We're told that we can have 10 different types of cars, but we can't have a flying car, for example, right? That real freedom thereby isn't simply the freedom to choose between things, but the freedom to make a decision about how those choices are framed and created. Now, that's the political ideological angle, if you will. And yet there's also a philosophical one. If you think about it, the whole Kantian revolution in thought, which precipitates what Hegel's able to do, all hinges on the difference between what in German is known as Schein and Erscheinung. Schein being that which is the illusion. Erscheinung is that which appears. In other words, Kant essentially has a distinction that becomes super important for philosophy, which is the distinction between appearance as illusion and appearance as representation, or appearance as phenomenon. This means that there's a difference between how something appears to you and the conditions by which it appears to you. Go back to the joke about the letter. If we simply focus on the content of the letter, namely everything is beautiful in the prison camp in Siberia, and the water is hot, and the prison guards are nice, except we don't have red ink. Here we have the content appears to transmit that everything is great in Siberia. And yet underneath the content, we know the code being that you need red ink to express yourself truthfully, thereby everything in the letter is false. And so the truth thereby in the letter resides not in its content, in what is depicted, the guards are nice, the weather is great, but instead in the form, in the fact that there is no red ink. Now, Kant does something that's analogous to this in his critique of pure reason. He essentially posits what is now known as critical transcendentalism, rather than the so-called naive transcendentalism of Plato. What does this mean? Well, let's go back to the difference between Schein and Erscheinung. Schein is the problem of illusion as appearance. For example, Plato's famous idea of a copy of a copy. Plato believed that there was an ideal iPhone that existed in the skies, and that therefore the iPhone I'm using now is but a poor representation of the essence of iPhone as such. Therefore, if I were to take a picture of an iPhone, it would be a copy of what was already a copy. Essentially, we have an ideal form that exists in a transcendental horizon, and everything that we try to do to reach it, whether we have objects in the world or depictions of objects in the world, are thereby a regression. This means that within Platonic naive transcendentalism, it's not simply naive in terms of pretending to be not knowing, but positing that there is something that cannot be properly known, that there is some ideal essence or form. This is the idea of Schein, appearance as illusion. Everything that is in the world is Schein. It's something that appears to you, but it cannot be trusted. This is like the if you will, the almost paranoid undercurrent that resides within Platonic idealism, is this idea that everything that you see in the world and that you sense is almost not to be trusted, because it is simply a refraction of the ideal. Now, Kant really makes a very radical leap by suggesting that we don't focus on Schein, but on the German Erscheinung. Erscheinung is how things appear to us. In other words, now we're focusing on how appearance, not what appearance is, but how appearance appears to us. And this may seem like a very small distinction, and yet it's a really radical one. In fact, the church was quite right in thinking that Kant was like one of the most dangerous threats to the church that had ever existed, even though Kant was a Christian, because Kant essentially undermined this idea of a father in the sky, or at least he started to undermine it. This is actually, there's an old joke that Schopenhauer has where it's well known that Schopenhauer accused Kant, he likened Kant of being like a man who goes to a masked ball. And at the masked ball, he's flirting with a woman who he thinks is really beautiful. And then finally he takes off her mask, and it turns out that she was his wife all along, that he was simply that the woman he thought that he was cheating on was his wife. And Schopenhauer's point, of course, is that Kant, in his project of philosophy, the critique of pure reason, thinks that he's seducing the woman with the mask, but underneath the mask is simply plain old-fashioned Christianity. That even though he thought he was practicing philosophy, he was just practicing Christianity. Now, like he was cheating on his wife, which was Christianity, and with philosophy, but it turned out to be Christianity all along. Essentially what Schopenhauer is pointing out here, which is not untrue, is that the whole Kantian edifice, which is to focus on this idea of Erscheinung instead of Schein, still upholds the idea of a kind of naive, transcendental, God in the sky figure. That's the famous Kantian idea of the thing in itself. Essentially what Kant has done, therefore, is that Kant has transposed the Platonic absolute, or the ideal, which for Plato exists outside the cave, right, in the transcendental horizon that is separated from the world of appearance. He's transposed that ideal form back into the copies, back into the forms. In other words, let's say that I'm using an iPhone, and the iPhone for Plato would be a mere copy of the ideal iPhone that exists in the sky. For Kant, the iPhone itself would have hidden within it its own essence, its own ideal. In other words, what Kant essentially does is that he performs what is known as a Kantian Copernican turn. He announces this as a Copernican turn, which is that he doesn't so much get rid of the idea of a transcendental frame, but he transposes it from a transcendental horizon, a naive horizon, into the objects themselves, which for Kant cannot be known. But of course, this is where Schopenhauer's joke makes sense, because Schopenhauer says that, you know, the man is flirting with the woman who's wearing a mask, and then he takes off the mask and it turns out to be his wife. Well, Kant is kind of doing the same thing, which is that Kant is flirting with the objects, the world of appearances, ooh, but then he says, well, underneath the objects of appearances, there is the essence, the pure form. And so he's essentially reverted back to a kind of naive Platonism or early Christianity that posits this transcendental horizon, but he simply locates it within the objects as such. And so I know explaining jokes is terrible, but essentially the Schopenhauerian joke is quite clever, because instead of saying we have my wife and the mistress, he's essentially positing that the wife and the mistress are the same thing. Of course, there's a very Lacanian element that you could add here, which is the whole problem of the wife versus the mistress, which is that the idea of mistress is, of course, overdetermined by the wife. That as many people will experience in their life, I mean, I haven't, but I understand many people do, is that part of the appeal of a mistress is that you have a partner at home, and that as soon as you tell your partner that you're going to go live with your mistress, then your mistress becomes your partner, and thereby you lose the essential quality of what was attractive about that person, which was that they presented themselves as a kind of fantastical escape. Anyway, so Schopenhauer's point is thereby essentially that Kant, even though he is critiquing the conditions by which reason can be known, in other words, how things appear to us, he nevertheless upholds the idea of a kind of transcendental that lies within the objects themselves. Now, what we're doing here, to make this a little bit more technical, is that we're really talking about the difference between content and form. Content is essentially what something is. Form is how it appears to us. The way in which that is usually posited in metaphysical terms is the difference between being and becoming. You may have also encountered in philosophy the difference between in itself and for itself. Essentially, this is like a distinction that runs throughout the entire history of philosophy, metaphysics, but also today, if you study art. For example, if you want to understand the trajectory that takes place from like figurative art towards modernist art, we also have the problem of content and form. Think about it. A symbol, which is like the earliest form of art, like a symbol, is pure form as content. We have irreducible tautology between form and content, hence also like the almost like pagan mystical quality here. The symbol doesn't just represent that which it is also that thing. Then we end up in the figurative art, which becomes more important for Christianity, which is how do we represent, for example, Christ on the cross. This then leads us to the moralizing neoclassicism, which takes allegorical stories from the ancient world and uses it to teach us lessons about wisdom and justice and chastity and so on and so forth. Again, we're playing with what does the content mean? What is the form in which it is represented? What happens eventually, and I actually did a much longer session on this in the Q&A last week about the history of art. What happens essentially when we get to modernism, and I mean, we can do impressionism, expressionism, but what happens within modernism is that the form suddenly becomes something which overdetermines the content. In other words, we become really aware of the form. If you will, you can relate this to the difference between Malevich's Black Square and Duchamp's The Fountain. In Malevich's Black Square, we have the problem of form as content. In other words, the black square, you can't really tell what is being depicted. Is it simply a neutral frame against which we have the content that has as of yet to be painted? Or is it that the content is itself the black frame? It's a very troubling image because it problematizes the relationship between form and content, between what something is and how it appears to us. In Duchamp's The Fountain, we have the radical conclusion of this, which is that the secret form is thereby not what is in the painting. The secret form is the form underlying the institution of the museum itself. In other words, you can take something as seemingly crass and obscene as a urinal, and you can put it in a museum, and it becomes art. It becomes an art object. And so here we have the transition, if you will, into modernism. First, the problematization of the relationship between form and content, and then the emphasis on the hidden form that lies within the representation as such. In other words, the underlying power of the gallery, the institution. And it's also a good way then to understand postmodernism. Postmodernism becomes then, how do we escape the problem of form as content? And so we end up in conceptual art. And like if you go today, like I did recently, to the Broad, and you see like a Jeff Koons sculpture, you see essentially where we end up with postmodernism, which is a kind of snake eating its own tail movement, where we have these giant blow-up balloon animals that are now represented as toys / art / object. You end up in a sort of ironic universe in which form and content bleed into each other. Although, you know, every once in a while, here we can see the Lacanian real creeping back in. There's a wonderful story that I saw in the news. So you can look it up, this Jeff Koons balloon animal. It's like an enormous sculpture. But there are also replica or smaller Jeff Koons balloon animals that can be purchased for great sums of money. And I actually took a picture of one of them because I saw one of them recently. And recently, one of them was on display in Miami, and they're very valuable. They're like, $45,000 each, which of course in the art world isn't very much, but these are replicas. And there was a woman who was sort of looking at it and poking at it, and at a certain point, she poked it slightly too hard, and it fell over, and it shattered into a million pieces. And what's so interesting here is that the people who witnessed this, the people who witnessed the shattering of the Jeff Koons sculpture, were all confused whether or not it was part of the performance. In other words, whether in Banksian fashion, remember how with Banksy the artwork was shredded and thereby became more valuable, right? Because now it was not just a work of art, it was also part of a piece of performance art, in other words, part of art history, thereby a higher valuation. In the same way, people thought that the shattering of the Jeff Koons sculpture was potentially simply part of the sculpture, that breaking it was now something that increased its value. Here we can see in the most material form the Marxist maxim about everything solid melting into air, that the process of abstract value thereby simply increases ad infinitum, or what in my ebook I call a spurious infinity, a false universal. Of course, in this case, the woman had really just broken the object, the art object, and so the value was lost. Although one thinks to oneself that the really smart move would have been to simply say, yes, I did this on purpose, that what appeared to be the problem is in fact the solution, and thereby it might have increased in value as such. Here we have, if you will, the Lacanian real emerging within the problem of form and content. Now, to pivot away from art history for a moment here, essentially, when Kant makes his argument about the relationship between Schein and Erscheinung, between appearance as illusion or appearance as representation or phenomenon, we have not just a debate between Platonic naive transcendentalism and Kantian critical transcendentalism, but specifically a problem about form and content, namely the relationship between the ideal content and its form. To go back to Plato, Plato believed that the manner in which the ideal content, essence, truth, is represented to us is always through a lesser form. In other words, essentially, Plato posits a taxonomy or a normative value system, a hierarchy, by which the form is lesser than the ideal, that the ideal loses some of its ideality, or whatever word you want to use, by means of being represented in form. And you could even see this in like linguistics today, or structuralism. Like think about how if there is such a thing as an idea that is pure, or pure thought, then as soon as you express it in words, does it lose some of its ideal content because it now has to be expressed in mere words? Think about, artists or lovers who say something like, if I had to say how much I loved you, it would no longer be real love, because now it would just be a mere mortal expression of something which cannot be expressed. Of course, the Kantian solution to this problem, which is also kind of a Shakespearean one, is to say the truest expression of love is therefore sublime. Namely, the truest expression of love is to say, I love you so much, I couldn't possibly put it into words. And thereby you have put your failure to put it into words, which is a very romantic thing to do. Instead of saying, I love you X amount, which would be crass, you say, I love you in a way that cannot be expressed. And so therefore you have expressed the inexpressible. And that is the sublime quality of love. It's the problem of the content of love in its form. You feel it, but how do you show it? How do you represent it? And think about the love languages today. Like the whole idea of the love languages is simply designed to assuage us and to soothe us into forgetting about this problem, the problem between content and form. You feel that you are in love, but how do you express it in a way that is an adequate representation of your true love without debasing it? Now, Plato is hardcore here. Plato wouldn't believe in the idea of a love language. For Plato, we have the ideal essence of something, and any way in which it is expressed through form or appearance is thereby already lesser. It's debased. Kant doesn't believe that. Kant believes that the way in which something finds its form or is expressed contains a kind of truth about the content itself. And this is actually where I want to make a pivot here. This is where we can make a really interesting pivot back to Freudian psychoanalysis and even Marxism. There's a great passage that Žižek has in The Sublime Object of Ideology, where he references the fact that Lacan jokes that it was, in fact, Marx who invented the symptom. And I want to explain that in a moment, but it's a little bit more technical. But we can actually start with like another Žižek joke, if you will, because it's sort of fun to sprinkle some of those in and to see how he uses those philosophically. Yeah, I thought someone was walking in right now. So essentially, it's important to note that when Žižek uses his jokes, they're always meant to be instructive and educational, but also part of entertainment. There's a great old Žižek interview where he talks about this. He says that if he has one pathology, like one thing that he feels like he should go to see a psychoanalyst for, it's that he has a pathological desire to entertain, that he feels like his work has to be entertaining because otherwise he feels like it's not worth doing. Like he worries that like it loses something. And so one of Žižek's hallmarks is that he uses jokes as a way to reach audiences and to illustrate philosophical arguments and points, which I think is a really interesting approach. I'm terrible at telling jokes, so I try to avoid it. I'm not as entertaining, but it's interesting sometimes to see like how the jokes themselves break down. Now, the joke in question here is an old Žižek joke where a Russian astronaut goes into space, and he comes back from space, and he goes to visit Khrushchev, and he says, Khrushchev, I hate to tell you this, but when I was in space, I realized that God exists, and he's out there, and I felt that God was there, but I know that we're not supposed to say that in the Soviet Union, but I believe God exists. And Khrushchev leans over to him and whispers, yes, I know he exists, but don't tell anybody. Now, a couple weeks later, the astronaut goes to visit the Pope, and, he's been told by Khrushchev not to admit the existence of God, and so he goes up to the Pope, and he says to the Pope, I was in space, and I don't want to tell you this, but God definitely doesn't exist. And the Pope leans over to the astronaut and whispers in his ear, I know he doesn't exist, but don't tell anyone. And here we have like a classic juxtaposition, unity of opposites, Hegelian problem, which is that, strictly speaking, the problem of God isn't whether God exists or doesn't exist. It's precisely the problem of the existence of God's inexistence, if you will. That is the problem of God, which is also thereby the solution of the faith. It's not to prove that God exists or to prove that he doesn't exist. It's about the existence, the irredeemable problem of his inexistence, if you will. And so that's a classic Žižekian joke. But what Žižek is also talking about here is the problem of symbolic identification. The problem of symbolic identification, or what Lacan calls the lack in the other, is that identity never takes place in a tautological, unary identity. Let me give you an example here. Adorno, the German critical theorist Adorno, when he writes about Beethoven, he has this beautiful observation about Beethoven's piano music. And for context, it's important to note here that Beethoven is part of what we know as classical music. Today we call classical music all music, but like it's a little bit like calling all philosophy German idealism. Like you simply take like the most predominant movement and you pretend like it's universal. But strictly speaking, in its historical context, classical music for Beethoven was falling upon Baroque music. And Baroque music was, classical music was supposed to be the antithesis to Baroque music, which is also why Romantic music follows classical music. Although here it gets confusing once again, because we think of Romantic music as schmaltzy, and yet the point isn't to say that it is romantic like you fall in love. Romantic classical music is music that is a form of idealism, that is part of the German idealist movement. In other words, the positing of a metaphysical problem about Schein and Erscheinung. This is also why Wagner, for example, who one wouldn't necessarily characterize as a romantic opera composer, except for Tristan and Isolde, of course, which is the pinnacle of Romanticism, is a romanticist, and also why Nietzsche hated Wagner for this, because he realized that he was an idealist, that he was positing this problem about Schein and Erscheinung, a metaphysical problem. Anyway, what I'm trying to point out here, although while I'm on a riff, if you're interested in classical music, so Beethoven's classical music is a response to like Bach and Mozart, which was part of the Baroque movement. And yesterday I went to a Mozart opera, which is the Marriage of Figaro. And what we see in the Marriage of Figaro, for example, is there's a harpsichord. So every time a character is about to say something or enters into a room, it goes ding, 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 ding. And it's almost like this comic note that takes place in the opera. The harpsichord is everything that Beethoven was against. So we see no more harpsichord. We see a complete movement towards the piano within Beethoven. And of course, Beethoven doesn't write an opera because that would not be very befitting of Beethoven. And yet, if you look at like the opening bars, or sorry, the final bars of the opening of the Marriage of Figaro, you can actually see the beginning of what in Beethoven would then become ba-ba-ba-bum. And so the transition there from what was known as Baroque music, or is now known as Baroque music, towards classical music is a very, like, it's not simply a refutation, it's something that emerges from within, in the same manner in which philosophy takes place. Philosophy is never about a linear progress by which you dispute what came before. You're always taking some of the problems that the previous generation grappled with, and you're approaching them from a different perspective. Anyway, my point, to go back to my original point, was Adorno. Adorno is writing about Beethoven. And Adorno has this beautiful line where he writes that within Beethoven's piano music, we find the identity of disidentification. Now, what does Adorno mean by the identity of disidentification? Essentially, the identity of disidentification for Adorno is that within Beethoven's piano music, we no longer have a strict forward linear movement by which we have the announcement of a theme that is then worked throughout the piece. Instead, and this is key, for Beethoven, the working through, the never arriving, is itself the piece. In other words, the identity is not posited as antithetical to non-identity, but it is the identity of non-identity as such. To go back to the problem of content versus form, here we have the transition from Baroque music, in which the content is depicted to you, like, again, character arrives on stage, right? The harpsichord underscores the movement and the plot that's taking place, towards Beethoven, where the form, namely the problem of the theme writing itself, is there by its own content. And also why, if you want to understand modernism, you really do have to go back to classicism and classical music to start understanding where these problems are coming from. Essentially what takes place, therefore, as Adorno argues, within Beethoven, is that we have the identity of non-identity. They're no longer posited as being different, but they're posited as being one and the same. Again, if you go back to the metaphysical proposition between Plato and Kant, we have something similar. If Baroque music was about Schein, was about, the trickle-down theory of the sublime, that, the beauty resides in the sky and all music is a form of worship and we're tapping into this transcendental absolute, then we find within classical music, for example, within Beethoven, we find a focus on the form itself, the form that's constantly writhing in its own becoming. In other words, we have the problem, which is the problem of essence versus appearance, and now essence as appearance. That's the transition that we have that goes towards Beethoven. And so, I just want to, one of the hotel's security people came in, they realized I was just talking about Beethoven, and they were like, that guy's no threat. Okay, so I'll give you another example, another Žižek joke while we're at it. So we're talking about this problem of identification, right? And Adorno's positing that Beethoven is essentially thereby the musician where the identity is of non-identity with itself. Žižek has a joke that he takes from somewhere about Jesus. And the idea is that Jesus decides one day that he wants to learn how to play golf. And he asks a friend, I want to go and play golf. And turns out Jesus is terrible at golf. And he says, but I want to be like Tiger Woods. I'm Jesus, I can be Tiger Woods. And so Jesus, imagining himself as Tiger Woods, swings, whatever it's called, the golf bat stick, and hits the golf ball into the water. And frustrated, Jesus decides to go and fetch the ball. And so Jesus is walking over the water and getting the ball. At this point, while Jesus is walking over the water to get his golf ball, a group of passerbys appear and they say, oh my gosh, that must be Jesus. He's walking on water. At which point the friend says, no, that's not Jesus. He thinks he's Tiger Woods. Anyway, I'm not good at telling jokes, but you get the joke. He thinks he's Tiger Woods. The problem thereby is the problem of identification. We never identify as such. We always identify through something else. That's the Lacanian idea, which goes back to Hegel, of symbolic identification or secondary identification. Think, for example, about how when you go to a Twitter bio, the politician will say something like, I'm a politician, but I'm also a dog lover and a mother, and I'm good at skiing or something. Oh, I think my phone overheated. Oh no. Okay, we've had a lot of troubleshooting today. The phone overheated because it was in the sun. Apologies to Instagram. Oh, that's so bad. Today's been a day of lots of technological troubleshooting, but I'll post the audio and that way everybody can access it later. So the problem of symbolic identification, therefore, is that identification needs something else to be grounded. Now here we have essentially also the metaphysical proposition, which is we have essence that's supposedly somewhere in the sky, and yet it needs to appear. It needs to make itself known as essence. In other words, it needs to succumb or fall into appearance in order to properly be considered essence. And so the question then becomes, what are the conditions by which essence emerges to us, which is the Kantian critique of pure reason. Now here, I want to end on a note that we can pick up next week, which is that here we have exactly the problem that Hegel is so interested in and that Schelling is so interested in, which is what is this foundation or this grounding where essence is supposed to take place? What is this Urgrund, or like foundational zero-sum location from which becoming emerges? Now, for both Schelling and Hegel, this location is a kind of void. You might even call it the void. And yet what's so crucial is that for Schelling, the void is not accessible to us. It exists outside our horizons of being. In other words, in an almost like proto-Lacanian sense, desire comes first. This is where Schelling takes from Fichte. Remember, Fichte's Ich philosophy that I covered briefly in the previous lecture was that the I posits itself, that we have to give primacy to how things appear, not to the essence that exists outside. What happens within Schelling, therefore, is that Schelling simply closes this tautological door by saying, yes, the I posits, but it posits against the horizon of the absolute, or the void. In other words, the void is there, but it's always out of sight. It's always out of reach. Now, Hegel swoops in and performs the dialectical move, if you will, which is that he transposes the gap between subject and void back into subject itself. In other words, the void, rather than being this immanent transcendental horizon, which therefore would be code for simply another form of vulgar transcendentalism, is now transposed back into subjectivity itself. In other words, if you take the problem of form and content, the content being the ideal content and the form being how it appears to us, Hegel says, what if it's precisely that the content doesn't exist extraneously to the form? What if the content's indivisibility lies within the form itself? In other words, Hegel really completes the Kantian Copernican turn. Remember, Kant, as Schopenhauer said, is like the man who is flirting with a masked woman who turns out to be his wife. In other words, he's in love with the transcendental essence, absolute, all along, even though he thinks he's flirting with the worlds of objects and appearances. Hegel is the one who actually runs off with the mistress and then makes it his wife. Hegel is the one who says, what if the object, rather than being the barrier towards essence, essence lies behind it, what if it's within the barrier itself that essence lies? And what's so important here is that Hegel therefore locates essence neither on the side of form, nor on the side of becoming. In other words, neither on the side of shine, nor on the side of shine. Instead, he locates it within the gap between the two themselves. In other words, the void is now no longer something primordial from which becoming stems, nor is it something to which we are moving towards. Instead, the void becomes the indivisible, as Schelling puts it, remainder that exists within appearance as such. In other words, this is why Žižek is obsessed with Lacan. In Lacanian fashion, it's not that we access reality by means of overcoming fantasy. We only access reality through fantasy. Or, if you will, to take Lacan's maxim that I talked about last week, where it's not that the truth lies underneath your mask, but that the truth lies within the mask as such, the Parisian veil. It's the same for the Schopenhauerian joke about Kant, which is to say, it's neither that Kant is that the mistress turns out to be the woman underneath the mask. It's that the truth lies within the mask as such. From Lacanian perspective, you could also argue that the truth lies within desire as such. And so for Hegel, the ontological proposition that Hegel is making about the relationship between being and becoming within metaphysics is that it's not about the division between naive transcendental idealism, which focuses on pure being, and becoming is a deviation from that, nor on Kantian critical transcendentalism, in which we focus on the appearance of being within the objects, which cannot be known, but precisely how within the unknowability of such, essence lies. In other words, Hegel makes a move, which is an ontological proposition that transposes the ideal into the division or the gap between the ideal and its own becoming. And so what appeared as a barrier or as an irredeemable antinomy now becomes its own solution. And that might seem like a very difficult thing to comprehend. And yet the good news is that we have like another 2 months to break down how that works. And what I'm trying to do in this lecture series is piece by piece give you these nuggets and link them to their historical contexts and their philosophical contexts, so that hopefully by the end of this lecture series, you'll be like, oh yeah, of course, that makes a lot of sense. If you're curious about how all that fits together, you can look back to the previous 3 lectures that I've posted. One is all about Schelling and Schelling's idea of the indivisible remainder. The other one is called How to Start or Where to Start with Hegel, which is like my attempt to give you like a crash course in Hegel. And then last week we had a lecture called Hegel Against Wisdom. And so those will all tie into what we've already done here. If you'd like to join me for this entire lecture series, you can download that on Patreon. I post the audio for every lesson on Patreon. I also post a Q&A podcast that I record with patrons after every lecture, which we're going to be recording 10 minutes from now. And you can also download my ebook that taps into a lot of these ideas as well. It's called Spurious Infinities, the Cultural Logic of Postmodernism. All that and more you can find on Patreon. Above all, I want to say thank you for watching. I want to say thank you to the patrons who fund this project. It's unreal to me that we get to have like a channel and a space where I get to do like hardcore philosophy, if you will, like without any compromises, without having to make good content. So thank you guys so much for that. It's really only possible because of the patrons. So if you'd like to become a patron, please do consider joining. It's also just a very fun vibe. It's a very friendly, open community, and I enjoy it a lot. Someone asked, what is the Schelling lecture called? I think it's called The Indivisible Remainder. I'm not sure. It's a couple weeks back. You should be able to find it here. On that note, thank you guys so much for being patient today. I know that we had some technical issues, and it's been a little bit all over the place. I'm still in LA. And as you can see, I'm in the hotel lobby. There's sunshine outside. In fact, it was so hot that our Instagram overheated, so we lost all our IGers. Thank you guys so much. I'm really looking forward to this lecture series on Hegel. I really hope that's valuable to you. My dream is to basically get other people as excited about Hegel as I am, which that's because I think Hegel is exciting. I hope you think Hegel is exciting. And if I can share that with you, that is an enormous pleasure. Thank you to the patrons who keep this project alive. And if you'd like to become a patron, please go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you next week.